do, however, deserve a fawning introduction. Jonathan Adler is the inaugural Johann Verbeesch Memorial Professor of Law and the founding director of the Coleman Burke Center for Environmental Law at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, where he teaches courses in environmental, administrative, and constitutional law. Incidentally, Professor Adler's center was one of the inspirations for the center that we're standing up now at the law school, the Environment Law and Economics Initiative. So thank you for trailblazing that. Professor Adler is the author or editor of 7 books, including Marijuana Federalism, Business and the Roberts Court, Rebuilding the Ark, New Perspectives on Endangered Species Act Reform, which I think I just got a copy of, or I'm going to get a copy. In 2004, Professor Adler received the Paul Bator Award, given annually by the Federalist Society to an academic under 40 for excellence in teaching, scholarship, and commitment to students. And in 2007, the Case Western Reserve University Law Alumni Association awarded Adler the annual Distinguished Teaching Award. My colleague, Alex Erwin, who teaches environmental law with me here at Florida International University, has a background in wildlife conservation and genetics. Professor Erwin teaches and conducts research in the fields of environmental law, natural resources law, combining his legal training with his background as a wildlife biologist. His research is situated at the intersection of environmental law, genetics, and conversation, so he fits right in at a conference, conservation, where he fits right in at a conference that's supposed to be bringing people in all those disciplines together. His research to date has focused on 3 issues: wildlife conservation and management, particularly through the lens of genetics and evolutionary biology, genetic engineering and related biotechnological developments, specifically as they relate to conservation and environmental protection, and more broadly, the interplay of science, law, and policy. So thanks to both of you, and kick it away on Endangered Species Act 50 years later.
Alrighty, thank you, Mario. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. So what I want to do is say a little bit about how we should think about the Endangered Species Act now that it's turning 50. As Mario noted, a little over a decade ago, I did a book for AEI looking at the ESA, anticipating its 40th anniversary. And this year, it's going to be turning 50. And the Endangered Species Act is distinct among our environmental laws for a bunch of reasons. One, I think, is unlike the various pollution control laws, unlike a lot of other environmental laws, it is explicitly and overtly about protecting something other than people, either directly or indirectly. It is about a commitment that we make to what we want the world to be like, what we want to preserve and conserve in the world. And that's certainly distinct from a lot of the other environmental laws that we have. As far as environmental laws go, it's pretty short, relatively easy to read, potentially quite powerful. It was once perhaps wisely or not, characterized as the pit bull of environmental laws because it's short, compact, and has one hell of a set of teeth. And it's been quite controversial throughout its history in terms of the way this short, compact, and strong law imposes trade-offs that are not always politically fun or politically popular. The question I want to pose, and I know what I've said about the Endangered Species Act in the past, and I'm in the process of figuring out whether or not I just continue to hew to my prior conclusion. There is a question about how ultimately effective it is, which is a little bit separate from the question of how successful we have been at conserving species, because, as I'm going to talk about a little bit, there are certainly some clear examples of successful species conservation efforts. One question that I think we need to think about is to what extent they are a consequence of the Endangered Species Act, or they're the consequence of something else. And if we want to improve species conservation efforts, that's obviously a question should answer. One thing I'm also going to focus on a bit is the extent to which the Endangered Species Act is successful at conserving species on private land. And one of the reasons I want to focus there is because, as I'll talk about, a large proportion of endangered species rely upon private land for some or all of their habitat. Also because the sort of policy measures that we may want to engage in are more challenging when they aren't simply a land management decision, but actually require infringing upon or involve potential conflict with other landowners. That's not to say that there aren't real and meaningful conflicts. For example, on federal lands, when endangered species conservation efforts limits the ability to exploit those lands for other purposes, but the nature of the conflicts, I think, are somewhat different. And I think that other than some of the very early conflicts under the Endangered Species Act, some of the ones that have been most intractable and have caused the most problems for species conservation efforts do result from the application of Section 9 of the Act, the part that applies to activities on private land that could take an endangered species more so than they do to other federal activities. So, in terms of evaluating the Act, the Act expressly says that its purpose is to recover species. Right? So the way the Act operates is that we identify species that we think are in danger of extinction and classify them as threatened or endangered. And this status has often been characterized as kind of the equivalent of a species being in the emergency room, that it's in a condition where it needs a degree of intervention or protection that we don't want it to have, and so the Act has an express goal of recovery, of getting the species to the point where it no longer needs the sort of treatment you get in the emergency room. And while that may or may not be the best way to conceive of what our goals in terms of species conservation and ecosystem protection should be, that is the goal that the Act sets forth and the way that the Act is structured. That is the goal that the Act focuses on, identifying species that are threatened and endangered, and then intervening so that they can be recovered. And so, one initial cut at how effective or ineffective the Act can be is looking at recovery. So, I keep forgetting that slide's there. So, we can, the Act, as of yesterday, according to Fish and Wildlife Service's website, there have been 2,372 listings and 104 delistings. Bulk of those listings are domestic, some of them, though, are foreign. So a very small percentage of species has been delisted. To what extent should that matter to us? I think early on, there was a strong argument that we wouldn't expect many species delistings because the nature of population dynamics for most species are such that it takes time, right? You're not just going to remove threats to the species, restore its habitat, and so on, and see a sudden rebound. We are getting to, I think, a point after 50 years where I think that argument is somewhat less persuasive, but the question would be, well, what's the right metric, right? So, 140 listings out of 2,300 species doesn't seem like a lot, but I'm not sure we have some clear benchmark of what it should be. I think what we really want to look at is something like how likely is a species to be delisted after a certain amount of period of time on the list, and perhaps we probably would even want to then break that up based on the type of species, making simplistic assumptions about how long it should be for same animals versus insects versus fish and so on. When we look at delistings, it is worth noting that not all delistings are for the same reasons. According to Fish and Wildlife Service, 11 of those delistings were because the species went extinct. Now, to be fair, most of those 11 were probably extinct before they were listed in the first place. By some estimates, there are another, I want to say it's like 80, 70 species that are still listed that probably have also gone extinct, but the most of them probably were also extinct before they were listed in the first place. That's some share of delistings. The data errors are either species that we improperly thought they were a separate species, subspecies, or distinct population, or we miscounted. Species that are endangered are often species that we are less familiar with, that we have less data about, and so when we discover these species, we may think that they are rarer than they actually are because we've never looked at them before. The most infamous example of this is probably the Tennessee snail darter, which we learned after the Tellico Dam controversy probably should not have been listed as endangered, maybe listed as threatened initially. It's now been delisted, but it turned out that it was capable of living and did live in places that we didn't think it was capable of living because prior to the 1970s we didn't know it existed and we had never really looked for it before. So there are 71 recoveries from the Endangered Species Act. And if we want to look at what it is that drives recovery or allows for recovery, I do think we need to unpack that 71 because different sorts of species have been recovered in different ways. And as I mentioned, I think in terms of the political controversy surrounding the Endangered Species Act, we want to pay attention to, or at least I'm particularly interested in, whether or not we're seeing recoveries on private land or on private land dependent species. So we can break down. All right, this is just more or less what I've been saying. So we have all these species that are listed, we have those that are delisted, we have those that are listed as recovered, and the question is how many are what I would characterize as regulatory recoveries. Those are the species that have been recovered as a consequence of the regulatory provisions of the Endangered Species Act, as opposed to species that have recovered due to other things. If we're interested in that, one thing we need to do perhaps as an initial matter is we need to focus on domestic species as opposed to foreign species because the Endangered Species Act itself doesn't really do a whole lot for foreign species. That doesn't mean there aren't regulatory measures that are helping those species. It just means that it's not the Endangered Species Act that's doing it for the most part, right? So there's some species of kangaroo that have been delisted. I will confess, I do not know what Australia did or did not do to help those kangaroo recover. I'm just confident that the regulatory provisions of the Endangered Species Act don't get credit for that. I also think we want to separate out animal species from plants because plants don't get the same degree of regulatory protection as animals do. And so, again, I'm not sure what the number of regulatory recovery is, but I think it's lower than the 39 species of animals that have been delisted or been classified as recoveries by the Endangered Species Act. But, why do I say that I'm pretty confident it's lower than 39? Well, one is we do get some double countings. So there are 9 separate listings for humpback whales as recovered. To be fair, only 3 of them are in domestic waters. That's it's not one. It's not counted once by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's counted 9 times. We get DDT birds, which clearly recovered as a result of actions by the federal government, the phasing out of DDT in particular. But DDT was phased out in 1972. The Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973. I think it's hard to credit the ESA with the phase out of DDT, and I think most folks think that that was the primary factor for most of the DDT birds. Some of them also benefited from other targeted regulatory protections under other statutes. But again, if the question is whether or not Section 9, the regulatory provision that primarily affects private land, is responsible for their recovery, it's hard to credit the multiple DDT birds as regulatory recoveries under the Endangered Species Act. There are some others that get more complicated, so here's a handful. Benefit about talking about the Endangered Species Act is an excuse to show pictures of the house. So we have the Palau fantail is one of several birds on the island of Palau which have recovered. Habitats recovered since World War II quite significantly on the island of Palau. Not through the Endangered Species Act did much to that. There's some island foxes. I always get them confused. There are 4 species of island fox. 3 of them have been classified as recoveries. 1 of them has been downlisted, and I always forget which is which. So But so 3 recoveries of island foxes, largely as a result of things like control of invasive species, feral animals, and like the nature of island-dependent species is they're often particularly vulnerable to things like invasives that can cause a combination of both habitat degradation and various forms of predation. True for a lot of island-dependent bird species. So it's been doing better. I think the Endangered Species Act probably deserves credit for this in that it likely affected the behavior of the land management agencies that are and helped spur some of the actions that led to predator control, habitat conservation and the like, but not through regulation of private land. There was a time when I was willing to say I wasn't sure there were any private land regulatory recoveries under the Endangered Species Act. I'm not sure I'm willing to make that claim anymore because there are species like the black-capped vireo, which is on the left part of the slide, which is dependent on a lot of private land, and the various conservation measures that have led to its recovery, I think, include finding ways of inducing changes in private land management that have been beneficial to it. So my current view is that it's not zero, but it's not as high as we would want it to be, given the fact that our best estimates are that about 2/3 of listed species rely upon private land for some portion of their habitat. About 1/3 of listed species rely upon private land for all or for a necessary aspect of their habitat. That is to say, if they're not conserved on private land, they will not be conserved, period. And so this fact that it's hard to find too many examples like the black-capped vireo should concern us. And should make us be concerned about whether or not, at least when we're talking about private land, whether or not this statute is structured in a way that is conserving species, or that's capable of conserving species to the degree that we would like it to. Now, what explains some of the problems on private land? Well, I've certainly argued, others have argued, that part of the problem is the punitive way the Act operates for private landowners. I use this old quote from Bruce Babbitt because I think it's one of the most candid and clear explanations of the way the Endangered Species Act is experienced by private landowners. When a species is listed under the terms of the ESA, there is an effective freeze across the habitat occupied by that species. In practice, this often means the Fish and Wildlife Service can send letters to landowners saying, hey, we don't know if what you're doing could result in a take of endangered species, but it might, and here's what happens to you if you do, and oh, by the way, you should try and get permit. And that's not a great thing. We now have a decent number of studies that are out in the last several years documenting the effects on private land values from listing of species, so they've gotten beyond anecdotes of that. We've also, at this point, have a decent number of species documented. With Sam Hamilton, who ran the Fish and Wildlife Service, said, which is that the incentives are wrong here, right? That if you're a private landowner, you find a rare mineral, he was from Texas, you find oil, you're thrilled. Your land value goes up. You find a rare species, your value disappears. And again, we now have more empirical evidence that is happening on when species are listed on private land. I think the other thing that's important for those incentives and things that I'm interested in is that it acts against the conservation ethic that is at least present among some landowners and is certainly present throughout large parts of the country. The conservation ethic that led to things like this. People saving wood ducks by putting up wood duck boxes. This wasn't the wood duck's natural habitat, but these sorts of boxes, which were mass produced by timber companies among other things and widely distributed, made it possible for landowners to create suitable habitat for wood ducks, also to habitat that was more resistant to predation than some of its natural habitat, and was responsible or largely responsible for the rebound of the wood ducks that we saw in the mid-20th century. And it's the sort of thing that a landowner can't do today with a listed species without putting themselves in legal jeopardy unless they want to go through the time and expense of getting a permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And if our goal is conservation, that's a problem. Now, and we know it's a problem, and I just have, this is a picture of red-cockaded woodpecker and Pro's meadow jumping mouse, because these are two of the better studies on kind of the systematic effects on landowner behavior and landowner willingness to maintain habitat or allow biologists access to land to conduct research on endangered species, show that this has broad systematic effects on landowner willingness to maintain habitat. So the red-cockaded woodpecker studies show timber owners systematically reducing the length of timber cut rotations in the presence of red-cockaded woodpecker habitat. The prevalence meadow jumping mouse study showing landowners becoming less willing to engage in conservation activities, less willing to allow biologists on their land as a consequence of the prevalence jumping mouse listing. We also can see the same phenomenon in terms of looking at some of the various things that have happened within the implementation of the Endangered Species Act. So, habitat conservation planning under Section 10 has become more prominent, more widespread. There is empirical research now showing that at least well-funded habitat conservation plans, that are single species conservation plans, do seem to produce benefits, including on private land. Of course, those are some interesting conditions, right? One is they need to be funded, which is not always easy to do. It is interesting that the empirical literature thus far shows this working for single species habitat conservation plans, but not for multi-species conservation plans, which is somewhat counterintuitive. And it may be a function of availability of funding, it may be a function of the fact that we implemented habitat conservation plans in those places where it was easiest to do. And so it may just be that the later multi-species efforts are just in harder context, we don't know. The other things I mentioned are things like safe harbors, no surprises, candidate conservation agreements with assurances, all of which I'm gonna just mention and not summarize because I'm already getting pressing against my time limit here. All essentially variations of the Fish and Wildlife Service saying to landowners, we will unplug portions of the act with regard to you if you promise to help us with conserving species. And also some of these efforts have begun, which began in the Clinton administration and have happened since, have produced some benefits. It should concern us that the way they primarily operate is by saying we are not going to enforce the letter of the law to you in order to make it work. Right? To get species conserved on private land, we are not going to apply the law as written. In some applications, there is a question of whether or not the way these vary, the no surprises and candidate conservation agreements and assurances themselves have been implemented are even legal. I can't say I know this with certainty, but there are good reasons to believe, with one exception, these haven't been challenged in court precisely for that reason, because they've kind of helped the act produce some results, even though they involve, as a legal matter, not enforcing it. But again, that should concern us, right? Because the way you make a law work is by departing from the way the law is structured. Perhaps we should modify the law to actually authorize these things and fund these things in a way that will be more successful. Last thing I'll just say is that I think the need to understand what does and doesn't work under the act is particularly important, because there are some challenges that are coming that are going to make this even harder, right? So we've been talking some this morning about climate change. That makes this harder. It makes it harder because of the effects it has on available habitat for species. They need to be paying more attention to things like migration corridors, paying more attention to the fact that some species are more amenable to migration than others. Pay attention to the fact that certain types of conservation mechanisms, whether it's land purchases or other things that seemed right at the time they were done, may have to be modified, right? If habitat is shifting, if species need to migrate, we might need to think about, are we conserving the right habitat in the right places? May also need to think about things like safe harbors and insurances, which may not account for the effects that climate change has. There are fiscal constraints. There is a decent amount of empirical work now that shows that if you can fund species conservation, at least for you can often produce some benefits, whether that's making modifications on the way federal lands are managed, or by providing funding for habitat conservation planning. But it's not as if the Fish and Wildlife Service has a robust budget, and it's, I'm not an expert on the federal budget generally, but I am, as Mario mentioned before, we're good at spending money we don't have, and you can't assume you're gonna be able to keep doing that forever. I also think that there are directions in administrative law and constitutional law which are going to create additional challenges for the Endangered Species Act. Certainly, the idea that agencies can stretch statutory language in new directions to deal with challenges like climate change is something the Supreme Court has indicated it is not a fan of. Whether or not imposing Section 9 constraints on landowners is going to be something that is seen as consistent with the Fifth Amendment's takings clause is something I wouldn't assume, especially given recent Fifth Amendment decisions by the Supreme Court. The trend line there, I think, is pretty clear. And so, we need to be thinking about not just what works within the statute, but also what within the statute is going to be robust, given these sorts of changes and challenges that we're going to face going forward. I've gone longer than I meant to, so I will stop there and turn the clicker over to Alex.
All right, gotta move closer. All right, am I on? Can you hear me? All right, cool. Thanks, Professor Adler. Thanks, Mario, Professor Loyola, for putting me on this panel. I've titled this Innovation for the Next 50 Years, ESA at 50. This is going to be a lot of somewhat disparate ideas, trying to get into the weeds a little bit to solve some of these issues that we're seeing. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Professor Adler said here. Let's see. All right, I'm moving. So, just for anyone who's not an ESA wonk, here's just like the most basic version of it. Section 4 gives Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service the ability to list something that is endangered or threatened. I'll talk briefly about what those mean in a second, as well as critical habitat for those species. Section 7 and 9 are the so-called teeth of the act, right? Section 9 says you can't do these things, and those things are pretty broad. It's everything from hunting, harassing, messing with, to modifying or destroying habitat in some circumstances. Section 7 says federal agencies, you need to not jeopardize conservation. You need to not adversely modify critical habitat. That tends to reach out onto private land as well through any sort of permitting decision. And finally, Section 10, I'm going to talk about innovation. Almost all of the innovation in this act from the agency has come as a part of Section 10. There isn't really a lot statutory in Section 10, but Fish and Wildlife Service has tried to run with the little bit of authority they were given to try to make what originally was seen as a very rigid, inflexible act into something that could bend enough to avoid getting repealed by the Congress in the 90s, effectively. All right, so I don't need to go into this very much. He's already mostly done it. Is it effective? It depends on what you mean by effective. Does it keep things from going extinct? Seems to, right? 99% of listed species have been saved from extinction. There's a number of studies that have come out in the last couple of years estimating almost 300 was the last estimate I saw of extinctions prevented by the ESA. Most extinctions were seen, the species would last seen prior to listing, right? But they don't recover, right? It's what was originally seen as, I think, an effort to quickly boost species back up to the point where they don't need management has turned into a perpetual life support system, right? We have thousands of species that are effectively languishing on this list, needing federal conservation, in theory in perpetuity. Okay, so I think this focus has been on this dichotomy between we succeed by preventing extinction, or we don't succeed because we failed to recover. I think it's worth maybe a slightly more nuanced look at are trends even increasing? Are population trends increasing? And we see not the best, right? Some are, right? This is from 2016, 35% of species were stable, 8% improving, but still over 50% were still declining. Now, ideally, we're slowing that decline, right? This isn't fine enough to show, have we at least halted that skid? But it's obviously reason for concern. If the purpose of the act, as Professor Adler said, is to conserve, and what conserve means is get off the list, well, we're not there yet. So the most obvious answer, if you ask me how would I fix the Endangered Species Act, would be money, right? Money is how you save species. That's what we've seen time and time again. It's pretty low-hanging fruit. If you look at this graph's a little small, but what it shows is that spending per species has gone down over time. Funding has gone up a little bit, but the sheer number of species being listed has exploded. So Fish and Wildlife Service is forced to stretch their budget further and further on a per species basis. More interestingly is this money is not spent in any sort of rational way. It's not spent in any sort of justifiable way. It is all over the place. If you like fish, you will be happy to hear that they receive the vast majority of this funding. Something like 80% of funding supports the 5% of species, right? So it's a massive disparity here. 15 species of fish, I think it's 8 salmon and 7 sturgeon, basically receive 50% of the budget. We really, really like our salmon. Now, there's been pushes for years to have some sort of prioritization scheme. Fish and Wildlife Service has a prioritization scheme. They don't really use it. There's been some evidence that says if they used it, it would work. Not really using it. There's lots of reasons why they may not. Political pressure. We like things that are cute and fun. Litigation is always one of the threats. But funding is needed even if they're not always spending it perfectly. Now, I think one of the trickier issues is this idea of if we're going to move forward, right? Professor Adler's talked a lot about maybe Section 9 is counterproductive. It's everyone gets scared of Section 9. As soon as the teeth come out, you do everything you can to avoid the teeth. And that includes, the classic shoot, shovel, and shut up. Get rid of the endangered species before it gets listed or before anyone finds it. A lot of this is created by this idea of the Endangered Species Act working as precipice regulation. Now, in an ideal world, you would tailor each regulation to each species, right? How vulnerable is that species? The more vulnerable it is, the tighter the regulation, right? That's the theory at least. But in reality, we're forced to put things into buckets, right? Biology operates on a continuum, law does not. It requires categorization. So we have 3 big buckets, effectively. Not listed, so no real conservation efforts outside of some voluntary stuff I'll mention in a little bit, up until it hits this first threshold of threatened. Once it's threatened, something kicks in. I'll say what that is in a second. And then there's the second threshold that you don't want to cross, right? Getting it bumped up from threatened to endangered. So what are these? So threatened species, well, I'll start with endangered species, right? They get the full measure of the act, the full protection. Prohibition against take, it's this very broad term. Now, if you're a plant, life's not as easy for you, less protection. But threatened species, what's interesting is Congress gave the agencies the authority to, whenever any species is listed as a threatened species, the Secretary shall issue such regulations as he deems necessary and advisable to provide for the conservation of such species. So it looks like Congress told the agencies, go ahead and tailor for threatened species. Figure out what works best and tailor that protection. Now in reality, that's not what we do. We have this lovely precipice issue, right? No protection, all the protection. Everything is scary, deal with it before it gets there, and then in theory, another jump. Now for many years, Fish and Wildlife Service has operated like this. They've used this blanket 4D rule to treat anything as threatened at the same level as endangered. We're just going to import take restrictions, and then we'll come up with special rules, sometimes, to reduce that protection. Now, they didn't come up with very many special rules. The Trump administration came in and did the opposite. They got rid of the blanket rule and said, in fact, threatened species don't get protection until we come up with a special rule. This is bad too because frankly, Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't have the money to be able to do this every time. That's, to be perfectly cynical, that's why this was done, right? That's why the blanket rule was repealed, to make it more difficult for protection. The other issue that makes tailoring really difficult is that there aren't really clear ideas of what it means to be endangered or threatened. these aren't biological words. There is no biological definition of what it means to be endangered or threatened. We have what Congress says it is: in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, or any species likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future. There's broad discretion there to say what is threatened or endangered. All right, so to what I think one thing that would be helpful here was how can we better align vulnerability to regulatory stringency, right? Maybe we don't always need the full hammer of the act. Maybe we can do something reduced and allow for, to promote conservation cooperatively. And that's what we'll see has been done quite a bit kind of before listing. So one thing, they need definitional clarity. People have been calling for years, for decades, saying, can you tell us what it means to be endangered? Can you tell us what it means to be threatened? Whether that's numerical, whether that's habitat lost. There are many other ways to do it. Florida's Endangered Species Statute uses the IUCN red list criteria to make those decisions. That could be done. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is, but something tied to biological reality explaining what this is would be helpful. On the other hand, I really think we need to make better use of these Section 4D rules, right? It gives the agency the ability to tailor regulation to the species at hand, to the specific problems. And when they've done them, they've been really creative. There was a really interesting paper Rob Fishman put out last year that went in, dug deep into all of these 4D rules and found a fair amount of success there when they were taken seriously, when they were built cooperatively, when there was money to make sure they were done correctly. Results were good, right? So it isn't just a basic reduction. Now, we can't do that for endangered species. All it is threatened. So in some ways, it helps that there is a definitional clarity. They can move that line to what it means threatened quite a bit before a court will step in and do something. Last, the first precipice from not listed to threatened. They've tried to do quite a bit about protecting candidate species, those that they say are eligible for listing, but frankly, we don't have the money to figure it out right now, so we're going to put them on this candidate list and make them wait. Now, the candidate list hasn't been quite as much of a thing since maybe 2014 was the last time they were using it fully. But as parts of these candidate conservation agreements, there's been protections put in place before and assurances given to landowners, given to states, given to municipalities. So if it does eventually become threatened or endangered, landowners are already covered. Secondly, I really think we should be using these 4D rules to tailor protection geographically. So one issue, the services have tried to kind of hide the ball with what they're calling a DPS, a distinct population segment, right? Congress tells them we can protect something that's a species, you can protect something that's a subspecies, whatever that means, and you can protect a distinct population segment. The Fish and Wildlife Service at least came up with a rule that says we're going to protect things that are discrete and significant. They really focused on evolution, right? Are these evolutionary significant units? Biologically, that's completely defensible. That's a good place to draw a line. I actually think they should get more fine scale than that. They should focus on management units. If populations are recovering, we should be able to move them from endangered to threatened, as long as it's not going to affect the population as a whole. And they've tried to do this. They've tried to do these weird delistings. This is an example from gray wolves, where they tried to basically delist all but a couple of populations. And the courts said, not under your current DPS rule, right? This doesn't mean that this isn't discrete or this isn't significant. I really think, and I'm currently doing a project going through all these DPS rules, less of a focus on what's discrete and more of a focus on management units, a lower level with benefits, protection generally. All right, so that's my bit on tailoring. Let's get more specific. Let's try to go from a hammer to the scalpel, right? But we're not going to get there, right? We're not going to get to recovery unless we also do something about recovery. It's interesting that recovery is the goal. Recovery is what we want to see. But the recovery provisions of the Act are the weakest sections of the Act, right? Section 9 and Section 7 are really a backstop. They're going to keep something from going into extinction, and they've done a pretty good job of it. But they don't do enough to get us over that hump to actually recover. And part of that is that the services come up with these recovery plans most of the time. They don't always do it, though they're supposed to. And there's nothing enforceable about a recovery plan. The recovery is poorly defined. Implementation of the recovery plans, there's not money to implement them, and there's no ability to enforce the implementation of these plans. There's a lack of actually tying recovery plans when goals are met as part of the plan. It doesn't mean we delist. We delist when we go back through the same factors we determined for listing in the first place. So I think there needs to be an effort to reform recovery, and there's been a push for this for quite a while. So my last bit on recovery, there's this idea that I think is persuasive that the vast majority of our endangered species, this is I think 84%, if I'm looking at it, are what we call conservation reliant. If we stopped captive breeding, if we stopped invasive species removal, if we stopped predator management, if we stopped habitat modification, if we stopped active management of these species, they would go extinct. They would immediately start to decline. That doesn't bode well for this idea of recovery. If recovery is to get them to a point where they don't need this anymore, and they're all seemingly going to need this into perpetuity, that's what the data is showing us, then how do we get there? If we don't want them to languish forever on the federal list, but we recognize that these species are probably going to need help, well, I think the states need to step up. I think there needs to be a greater involvement of the states in this implementation of the Endangered Species Act. And the last 10 years has seen a huge movement around these big, broad candidate conservation agreements with the states. So you have the Sage Grouse Initiative, you have lesser prairie chicken work across New Mexico, Texas, the Great Plains. These efforts to keep things off the list by doing proactive conservation before they get to a point where the agency has to determine that they're threatened or endangered. Now I'll say it's still up in the air how well these actually work. The two kind of shining examples were sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken. Well, they're both currently being listed, right? These CCAs weren't capable of keeping them off the list. Now once they go on the list, these assurances will continue. Landowners that are already enrolled will know what they're getting themselves into, and there's seemingly going to be a big push to get other landowners involved as part of these agreements. On the other hand, states have not always shown themselves to be the most reliable partners. Wolves came off the endangered species list for like 6 months maybe before the courts reinstated them. Well, the state of Wisconsin had a wolf hunt where they overshot their wolf population, their stated goal in 2 days by 84%. They shot almost double what they were expecting to shoot. Okay, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence that once we drop the protections, the states are going to immediately be able to pick up where the feds left off. So how do we incentivize state involvement? Well, again, I go back to funding. So much of this does come back to money, right? Funding that's not tied to perverse incentives. If you know much about state game management or state wildlife, I just did it, right? State wildlife conservation tends to be game management. They make their money through hunting, through fishing. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it creates perverse incentives. So if there's one thing I leave you with, it's go talk to your congressperson or your senator about RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It was so close to passing. It is bipartisan. It's so rare we see bipartisan environmental law, bipartisan conservation law. Really had broad support, and it fell apart at the very last hurdle on the last day of the session because they couldn't figure out exactly how to fund it. They were going to close this crypto loophole, but there is real belief that this can get over the line, that this will make a significant difference in funding conservation in the states and giving states money to do this kind of proactive work and potentially to pick up where the feds leave off. Now, I think there also needs to be more involvement of the states in these 4D rules. I think using these 4D rules as experimental delisting trials, right? Giving the state authority and seeing what they do with clear guidelines guidelines for what happens if they fail as part of the 4D rule is well within the service's authority. They could do this without stretching the meaning of the act too far to rile up the major questions doctrine. What else? Increased state involvement in species assessments. The states tend to know better what they've got. And maybe last, so interestingly, Florida is the only state in the country that has any sort of authority to issue ITPs, incidental take permits. They did this in 2012, and people thought maybe this was a thing that's gonna happen. No one else has picked up on it. I don't know that there's much information on how successful or not it's been, but this is another place to get the states involved to help deal with what happens when things do eventually recover and come off the list. Right. Lastly, I don't need to talk about private land conservation, though I will say the Biden administration right now is doing some things. There's currently rulemaking about streamlining Section 10 permitting. They're going to combine candidate conservation agreements and safe harbor agreements and streamline the permitting. What else? They're working on clarifying conservation banking rules right now. There was a draft notice of rulemaking maybe 6 months ago. For my own work, thinking about what does it mean to what does wildlife conservation mean in the future? Assisted migration, or I've written recently about genetic engineering, is something we might have to consider for some species if our goal is to get them off perpetual management and back into the wild. So I'm sure I'm way over my time. I think that's all I've got.
So I think we have 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more for questions. Please.
To what extent is genetic diversity considered in the in recovery or taking them off of the endangered species list?
So it's definitely something that's considered. It's not one of the explicit factors are things like disease and predation. Are there other habitat loss, over harvesting? Are there other conservation measures that are being done? But every recovery plan they do has a section on genetic diversity. At least for, a lot of times we don't know. We don't have enough information to say anything discreetly. But it's there. It's kind of buried under the surface. I don't think it's like one of the main criteria they make their decisions based on. But it's one of many that's under.
Did you want to answer?
No, I agree.
I found interesting this point about agencies getting the revenue from selling permits for game, and that might discourage them from wanting to conserve predators, which hunters, fairly or not, perceive maybe as a threat to limit hunting opportunities. What do you think about the idea of agencies being able to auction out permits, say for predators, say for wolves or grizzly bears, and allow the winner of the bid to not exercise that hunting license? That would generate revenue for the agency and give those conservation interests a method to express their values.
I mean, frankly, most of the agencies that have populations of lions, of black bears, of wolves that have been delisted, they hunt, right? They hunt wolves, they hunt lions, they sell tags. They're not super popular. I think you have to be a certain kind of hunter to have either the dogs you need or the skills to want to go hunt lion. I think that is one way to do it, but there's such a strong lobby for hunting lions. I did a lot of work on mountain lion hunting, so I keep coming back to that. There's a strong lobby for looking for mountain lion hunting. I think if you try to make it a very narrow lottery system, because they do lottery systems. They have lotteries for bighorn, they have lotteries for elk. It's something they're already doing, but having a lottery, keeping folks from getting to however many wolves they think they should hunt or how many lions they think they should hunt, I don't see states moving towards that direction. Maybe I don't know if I answered the question, but.
No, so I'd make a broader point. I mean, and we may disagree on this, we may not. I mean, one of the reasons why the work that Alex wants to do on things like 40 rules looking at what's been done with threatened species is so important is because for threatened species, you can experiment, and you can try things, and you can work with states to try things. At least as the law is written, once a species is listed as endangered, you can't. You can try on, or to deal through the back door through incidental take permits, but that's limited, and as I've already mentioned, I happen to think the Fish and Wildlife Service has already gone beyond what it's legally allowed to do, especially with the assurances. Like when the prairie chicken and the sage grouse are listed, I'm not sure how much I rely on the assurances those landowners think they had. What I've argued for is that one of the things we want to do both for the scientific integrity of the listing process and so that we can try things like that. If you look at one of Alex's slides showed that the conservation reliant species, 66% of them require controls of other species. Some of that's predators, sometimes that's invasives, species that compete for the same habitat niches or compete for the same, but that's a lot. And there are maybe lots of ways to look at how you can use that as a funding dynamic. If it's predators, do you allow hunting of predators? If it's competition with another species, do you allow some sort of bidding mechanism so conservation organizations can try and influence priorities of the agencies? But once something listed as endangered, the way the act's written, you lose a lot of that flexibility. One thing I'll just note that we were talking about this at lunch, and it challenged my priors. There is some research that suggests right now that the citizen supervisions of the Endangered Species Act, in practice, are actually encouraging more successful conservation efforts, which is not. There were anecdotal reasons to be suspicious that that's what was happening with citizen suits under the Endangered Species Act, and certainly the experience with citizen supervisions in other statutes suggests that there are other incentives that people are responding to in terms of who gets sued and where and why and so on. And it seems to suggest that when you create mechanisms for participation by conservation organizations, you are to some degree allowing folks to act on both preferences and knowledge that the Fish and Wildlife Service itself is able to act on. I would love to expand those sorts of opportunities. Section 9 just does not give you a lot of means of doing that. So you either have to place a lot more emphasis on what's going on with threatened species, or you have to figure out a way to decouple listing from what are these fairly aggressive and uncompromising hammers in the statute.
So I have a quick questions to finish up here. So one of the insights of habitat ecology and evolutionary biology is that for every species that we know is endangered or threatened, there are probably 10 more that are also endangered or threatened that we don't know about. And if you could go back to the beginning and rewrite this federal law, we would probably come out being called something like Endangered Habitat Act instead of Endangered Species Act. Maybe. I think that it would be much more of a habitat conservation focus than was in the original law. And interestingly, and some of you can disagree, or whether you think that this has worked out well, the federal court ruling that took the definition of the word harm and the definition of take and said harm includes habitat modification, essentially had the effect of turning Endangered Species Act into a kind of endangered biodiversity-rich habitat act, didn't it? At least it's a step in the direction of that evolution. Does it need to keep moving forward in the direction of a habitat focus as opposed to a species focus?
Maybe. I mentioned before, the empirical evidence on multi-species habitat conservation plans versus single-species habitat conservation plans, the empirical evidence thus far suggests they're not more successful, even though there are all sorts of reasons why we would expect them to be more successful. There are all sorts of things that are hard to tease out of the data that may be confounding that result, but kind of landscape scale, multi-species, do it all at once, we have not yet figured out how to do that successfully enough. That could be the way the law's written, that could be what was in the queue first, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but it's not clear that would be more successful than what we're doing. We also have chosen to save some species in certain contexts because we like them, not because that's the direction ecosystems on their own are moving. And that may be okay, but we definitely made that choice.
Yeah, I disagree with, I think, two things you said. I wouldn't go back and turn this into the Habitat Act. I mean, I think there's a room for that. That's why we have so much federal land management, we have state land management. I think protecting habitat is obviously crucial for protecting endangered species. But Congress made a point to say we want to save every species. That's the goal of this. They put value on those genetic resources. This idea that each species has value to us and we should protect it for that reason. So I think they made a very calculated plan that that was what they wanted to do. And I don't think that was wrong. I think that's still, at the end of the day, why we protect endangered species. I think it's hard to come up with any other justification for why we need everything other than because we want everything, because we think that's what we decided. I think, has it moved? How much enforcement actually goes on with habitat modifications?
That's a hard thing to measure. It depends what you mean by enforcement. I mean, our bird letters enforcement. I mean, if you're on the receiving end of one, you probably think that's enforcement. The number of people that actually get prosecuted is relatively, under Section 9, is relatively low.
Which is my thought as well, which is why I don't know that I feel like it's totally moved to this from species to broader habitats. Even though that was also one of the original things, it wasn't just to conserve species, it was conserve species and the habitats in which they're found, right, is the purpose. But no, I don't think that we've jumped the shark here, right? Like, enforcement is always going to be so low, and it's even harder to enforce habitat modification. We can send scary letters, but I don't know that there's much more than that. I don't have the data to say that, so.
I don't know what you do though.
This discussion brings up another point of codependent species, and how is that figured into this act?
It's not unless that's accounted for in the recovery plan, and it works in multiple directions, right? In the sense that there are some ecosystems where you can't maximize for multiple species simultaneously because of their different needs. I mean, the example that I like the most, which only is in Yellowstone, you can't maximize elk populations and wolf populations simultaneously. You want to increase wolf populations, your elk populations are going to be lower. You'll get more birch trees as a consequence, and so if that's what you want, I will confess, I prefer wolves to elk, and birch trees are just kind of like the bonus, but you can't maximize both. And in recovery plans, we sometimes account for that, try to. As the slide Alex showed, I mean, of the conservation-minded species, the majority of them require some amount of active consideration or active management of other species. And sometimes that's ensuring codependent species are there, sometimes it means constraining, controlling, in some cases eliminating competitors or predators.
Thank you very much for that. We can roll right into the next panel.